Thank you for coming into the plenarium. I know, this is the phase in which we all just can't tear ourselves away from the breaks for chatting with our colleagues and much missed friends. But welcome and thank you for being here. And thank you, Wendy, in particular, for preparing what I think is going to become a very interesting presentation. I saw in your slides that you actually talk a little bit about who you are yourself, right? So I'm not going to try and do one better than Wendy talking about Wendy. That seems like a bad idea. So I'm leaving that up to you. But I've known Wendy since 2005 when we met at the first World Future Studies Federation conference that I went to, and don't think it was your first one, where immediately she gave me a good opportunity to learn straight from the horse's mouth, actually, as they call it. And I hope you will all enjoy a similar experience during this session here. And you will notice that we prepared for us to fill in our roles in a slightly different than completely standard way in the latter part of the presentation. But for now, I think it's time to pass on the microphone, which is actually standing there for you. You don't, then you can have this one.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And so we'll think of this in the best of Pacific Island traditions as the talking stick. And at various points later this afternoon, we hope to be passing it around. Could I, thank you, start the slides. So we hope that you'll enjoy the conversation this afternoon. And I know you've been tearing yourself away from what were fascinating conversations based on all the ideas that you've been hearing and sharing over the last day and a half. And it is very tough to tear yourself away from those conversations over a cup of coffee. And of course, we are also somewhat handicapped by the fact that this is the last session of the day. And so many people are getting a little low on energy. So we hope to be lively. And in fact, I was thinking after our conversation over and after lunch that maybe we should have retitled this the World Future Studies Federation Ladies Conceptual Mud Wrestling Plenary, because we're going to be very honest and talk to you about some of the things that we've been wrestling with. But first, to make good on my promise with regard to the abstract I submitted, I do want to talk a little because I want ideas and help, and it will lead into the second half of, or the beginning actually of the conversation. I want a little help with something I've been working on, and some of you may have seen part one of this at the Global Foresight Summit. I did a presentation called It's Chaos Turtles All the Way Down. And it was a bit of a historical tour through the evolution of my work with and acquaintance with and understanding of a classic futures tool, the futures cone, right? So this is the sequel. And with all sequels and with all, second episodes, there's a little bit of, as you may remember in our last episode, when Wendy was trying to integrate her interests in futures, stories, science fiction, the strange, and travels as a family preoccupation to see new things, and she was thinking through abstract concepts about how change happens and how messy it is, I basically engaged in something that I think of as smudging the futures cone and coming to the realization about stories being used to really sense-make turbulence. And so I was asking in that presentation, what does the warped plane of the present intersect? And I think of the present not as a point, a dot, which a lot of futures cones represent it as, but as really a phase space that we're all occupying in slightly different ways at slightly different times, and that intersects with the phase spaces of pasts, the different possible futures, different events. And so I sort of shared this very ancient futures cone, so ancient. It was actually from my PhD dissertation in 1995. And the one upside of it is that at least I did include history. And then I took you all the way up to one of the very most recent pieces of work on the futures cone by Nandis Christophilopoulos, where he was expounding on sort of what physics can contribute to our understanding of past, present, future, time, space, and cones of everything. And I said, that's great, and also he's finally made some of those paths from the past into the present and from the present into the future curved, because wow, all those futures curves, all those futures cones really loved straight lines. And we all know that change does not happen in straight lines, right? So, brief interlude between the previous episode and this episode is that I've been working a lot with the folks at the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies, working on concepts and sort of theories of change around what Zia Sardar has been calling post-normal times. And of course, our colleagues, John Sweeney and Jody Serra and Liam Mayo and Chris Jones have also been working in this area. And for those of you that may be a little new to it, post-normal times was theorized as an in-between period where old orthodoxies are dying, new ones have yet to be born, and very few things seem to make sense. Yeah, the last 2 years, okay. So, or as the Italian journalist Mauro put it in his conversation with Zygmunt Bauman, we are all hanging between the no longer and the not yet, and thus we are necessarily unstable, which to me sounded like another good way of thinking about that sort of warped plane of the present. We are living in a transitional age, a time without the confidence that we can return to any past we have known, and with no confidence in any past to a desirable, attainable, or sustainable future. Wow, that is so depressing. Okay, so how do we think about post-normal times in ways that are more hopeful and optimistic, given that it is the essence of chaotic uncertainty. It is a context in which facts are uncertain, values in dispute, stakes high, and decision urgent, which is the formulation that Funtowicz and Ravitz basically came up to when they first started talking about post-normal science, which is kind of what prompted Zia Sardar to think about it more broadly. And the conception, again, that the team at the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies has come up with to sort of characterize how post-normal times occur is that they emerge when we've got increasing contradictions, chaos, and complexity that are interacting and amplifying each other and generating post-normal phenomenon, generating the strange, making the familiar unfamiliar, generating surprising events. And that happens when change has hit extreme levels of speed, scope, scale, and simultaneity. So that's sort of post-normal theories in a nutshell. And out of that, the chaos turtle futures cone. The idea that basically what we're actually moving through from the past through this plane of the present that is warped and experienced differently in different ways at different times by different people, and moving forward into the possible futures is that we're really moving from chaos and turbulence to chaos and turbulence, and that has become something of a dance. So the Chaos Turtles Futures Cone, as it says here, filled with evolving attractors, strange attractors of change, and the paths of our dance of life are always challenged and adapting. So we always face different patterns of turbulence. We have to take different adaptive paths, And we are swirling, we are not taking straight lines, through paths across the infinite boundary of the present. It is always the present. It is now the present. It is now the present. It is now the present, into the infinite possibilities of these gently bounded attractors. So, yeah, the chaos turtles are dancing. Now here's the thing. We're all of us either in future studies or interested in future studies or have commissioned future studies. And as part of that, of course, and I was thinking about this in a chat I was having about some of the difficulties in engaging in anticipatory governance and policy work, where, of course, who's been asked this question? So, what are you predicting for this trend? Or, which one of these scenarios is right? So there's this notion that we're always having to try and gently extricate ourselves from expectations of prediction and remind people that what we engage in is forecasts. We don't say it's going to rain at 6:30 tonight. We say there is an 80% chance that it might rain this evening. That's an example. It is not true. As far as I know, it's going to be sunny and, clear the whole day. So one of the reasons why we always have to bound even forecasts based on really rich data sets about which as much is known that have been confirmed and legitimated, one of the difficulties is that any change, of course, happens against this turbulent context. So you can't predict complex systems in contexts that are rocking back and forth between stability and chaos. You can forecast, but even these forecasts, these trend lines, hit the moment of the present, and as soon as they move one click further into the future, they immediately start entering a fog of uncertainty. The closer the trend line is to the present, maybe the narrower or the lighter that fog is, but the further forward you go into the future, the wider the bands of uncertainty. So, I kind of went from there to thinking, okay, so the problem with that is that when we're all thinking about scenarios, when we're thinking of images of the future, when we're thinking about narratives, we're not even limiting, we can't limit ourselves to one trend. Any story about futures that are emerging is going to combine a multitude of emerging changes, of trends, of weak signals of change, all of which, again, as we think through them, will, the further forward we try to think about those trends, those changes, the wider those bands of uncertainty, the greater the fog of uncertainty. And we're layering them, right? We're layering trends. We're layering weak signals to create stories of alternative futures. So all the futures we think about encompass the interplay of myriad changes and the uncertainty bands that come along with forecasting or exploring their outcomes. So those overlapping trends are colliding, they're interacting with each other, creating more turbulence, amplifying each other in some cases. They are creating cascades of impacts. Those are interacting, those are colliding, and all of that is what drives the evolution of different possibilities forward into the future, and all of that is what we try, sometimes well, sometimes badly, to encompass with our imagination or to think through with our anticipatory skills. And so, we're thinking about potential futures, we're thinking about outcomes that, if you think in graphic terms, could be mapped onto a space. So each of those dots could represent a different future, in which case, that's not really a set of rising dots, it's an attractor. Stories align. So when we think about scenario archetypes, when we think about archetypes of images of the future, they are categories, they are themes, they are thematic clusters of possible futures that all align in certain ways. And we could, on the one hand, say that something like the business as usual future or the continued growth future is an attractor in the sense that it's a conceptual map of different futures that are different kinds of outcome in the sort of conceptual phase space of the continued growth idea, all of which might play out slightly differently in different locales, but are still bounded by this conceptual boundary of the continued growth idea. And so part of that dance that those chaos turtles are doing is responding to turbulence by sense-making with stories. And the stories themselves are creating essentially attractors in the sense both of sort of defining a space in which different outcomes fall that are loosely aligned, but also literally are attracting us, right? Scenario archetypes attract us in one way or the other. And they not only help us map different ideas about the future, but they can also constrain our thinking if we limit ourselves to thinking in terms of specific archetypes. So essentially, we're simplifying our dance card. I don't know how many of you, and I'm thinking probably for the men in the room, the answer is not many. I don't know how many of you have ever read Regency romances, or perhaps seen the recent, what was that Netflix, Bridgerton? Really popular sort of Regency serial that a lot of people were watching during pandemic lockdowns. And the notion of ballroom, formal ballroom dances, there was literally something that was a dance card. And you would put specific people's names or specific local events in space and time next to specific kinds of dances. So in this case, think of the dances. Is it a waltz? Is it too early for foxtrots? Waltz, folk, country dance, I don't know what dances they had in the Regency era, are literally sort of our archetypes. You're choosing a certain pattern of moving through space and time to music with a specific partner at a specific time in response to a specific social occasion. That's stretching the metaphor a bit, but archetypes do that. They simplify our dance cards with regard to turbulence by collapsing huge arrays of stories about possible futures into categories of archetypes, right? They act as a taxonomy. And so the archetypes are the bounds and shapes of our narrative attractors, and within them are specifics about how a future might play out in a particular place, in a particular context, in a particular culture, as lived day-to-day experience. So, they are patterns of possible futures, but they also pull our imaginations towards them, attracting literally. And so the good part about that is that they can align actions or responses if we share the language of the story, of the attractor, possibly enabling us to bridge from turbulence to stability, or to amplify turbulence if they are contested, conflictual, colonizing. So, upsides and downsides to thinking in terms of archetypes. We're sense-making. The archetypes help us remind us that there are very many patterns of dance. So that can be one of the useful things. If you're talking to a group of people that are used to thinking in terms of business as usual or continued growth, you can say, there are several alternative stories about the future, and I'm going to put you into one and ask you to think about what it means for how you should respond. And I'm sure a lot of us have used that exercise or similar futures exercises with different archetypes. My concern, as I see more and more people using archetypes in really interesting ways, tomorrow we're going to be talking about, in another panel, on evolving tools. Future studies is really going through an awesome phase of blossoming conceptual frameworks, new tools, new approaches, spreading futures literacy, thank you, Reel, all around the world, getting more and more people engaged in this conversation. That is amazing. And yet, one of the things that strikes me in terms of an overall sort of history of the context of archetypes as something that we developed in futures is that I'm a little worried they've been growing leaner, simpler, and fewer. So, how many people are familiar with Jim Dator's Manoa or Hawaii 4 futures? Right? There have been games based on them. They have been, a variant of them is used in a lot of the Institute for the Futures work. They crop up in a lot of places. They're really useful shorthand to moving quickly into the future. 4 futures, and I have Jim Dator's name up there. I also have Clem Beazold's and Chris Jones, because Jim actually created these basically by distilling what he was hearing about the future as he traveled all around the world and talked to people all over the place about the futures they thought possible or desirable, where they were, things that they were thinking about, concerned about, all the reading he was doing in the growing field then of future studies. Clem Beazold followed it up with more content analysis, and Chris Jones, this is possibly a little known fact about Chris, but while his dissertation was on feminist futures, his master's was actually a project that added to the content analysis that fed the background for the 4 futures. 4 futures: continued growth, collapse, discipline, and transformation. I'm still surprised when people talk about those as the Hawaii futures. Because when I was actually a grad student in Hawaii and we were doing incasting, there were more. And the 4 futures are now thought of as characterized by the shape of change. When we were originally working on them, they had more, shall we say, descriptive characteristics that differentiated them. Now, I understand why you simplify when you are trying to introduce a concept. You want to make it easier for people to take it in, to start interacting with it immediately, to start using it for sense-making immediately. And in that regard, the simpler set has been fantastically successful. But I keep wondering what we're losing when we lose detail and granularity. The other thing about the archetypes is that we need to constantly be refreshing them. And oh, please, we need to widen them. The research, Jim talked to people all over the world, but a lot of the research since then has, as far as I know, and I am limited by my inability to read widely in research journals in other languages, but a lot of the research since then has been focused on sort of content analysis and adding more data from basically English language research. So let's think about moving beyond the 4 futures to more futures. Not in every use case. The 4 futures are still very useful. But again, if we think about all the dancing with turbulence we have to do, I think we need a little more flexibility in our dance card. Also, we need to represent all of the invisible people. We're going to have a chat about the invisible people in a little bit. We need more story collections of ambient futures. Some people have been working on that. We need to balance out the fact that we tend to privilege as researchers the stories of the future we help people create, rather than starting, as a lot of, rigorous future does, with inventorying the current state. We are awash culturally in images of the future. We are awash in images of the future just counting all of the images of the future that are in all of the heads I'm looking at. We don't very often inventory them. So who's collecting stories? Who's doing content analysis? Well, I can say that I have at least done a little bit of contribution to that research, working with, in fact, Nicola George, a civil servant with Natural England, looking at scenarios for England's natural environment, and we did a compendium of all of the research projects that we could lay our hands on, again in English, my apologies, that touched on environmental futures. And this was back in 2011. We were looking at projects basically from roughly 1995 to 2010. And we sorted them and discovered that indeed they did fall into archetypes. Humans like patterns. We like telling stories. There are only, what do they usually say in drama? There are like 4 plots or 10 plots that classically repeat in all plays and stories. Same is true of futures. So here is our slightly more detailed kind of framing of the different archetypes we found and their relationship with each other. So business as usual, vulnerabilities to business as usual, going for growth, intensified business as usual, sustainability, local high cooperation, sort of spiritual transformation, and worldview paradigm shift, technology and innovation transformation, eco-angst, eco-transformation. So, there are all of these images of the future that are out there. That was us doing content analysis of, again, research projects where people were deliberately creating stories about the future. But did we look at sort of general content analysis of arts and business paradigms and political ideologies and movies and television and novels and sculptures and paintings about the future? No, we didn't. But people are starting to do that. So let's give thanks to Alessandra Fergnani and Zhao Li Song for the work they did in analyzing, I think, over 100 science fiction films set in the future and finding 6 scenario archetypes. But again, these were mostly films in English. Okay. So this is what we're getting to. This is going to be the conversation. Is it time for more silent listening on all of our parts? We facilitate futures building processes, and that's how we earn our money, our living, many of us. I'm one of those people. Academics, we progress by publishing analyses and engaging in academic projects focused on building futures. We earn by selling fabricated futures. So we are all, as professionals, kind of invested in futures that we make via processes where we get people into a room and say, we're going to take you through this fantastic, imaginative, creative, exploratory, critical, systems thinking based, collaboration where we're going to look at emerging changes and imagine what wild and amazing and wonderful and possibly horrible things could emerge. And it's fun and we like it, and our participants usually like it, but we're building stories of the future that are frequently at an institutional level, and we're having people build stories with processes, with building blocks. So it's time to start meditating on the ambient and talk to the invisible people and find out from them what the images of the future that are in their minds are, because that will help us re-perceive, reframe our questions, and avoid stumbles in all of this turbulent dancing. Now, one of the things that I can tell you as a bit of a preview for tomorrow, for those of you that are still around and not flying off, the Futures Foresight Europe Network is engaging in a process called Our Futures. I know this is confusing. There is a game that the Global Swarm does called Our Futures. This is a different Our Futures. This is actually a Europe-wide project going on for an entire year, starting based in the Conference for the Future of Europe, that is using a narrative platform called SenseMaker to collect stories about the future. And so for the next year, different groups going out to schools, going out to civic societies, talking to people in neighborhoods are going to be collecting the stories of the future that are in people's heads, whatever they are. So here's the question. We want to start searching out stories. We want to start decolonizing the archetypes. And there's been a massive amount of really fantastic work in futures over the past few years on decolonizing futures itself as a broader field. And you can look at the work of people like Pupul Bisht, Leah Zaidi, some of the great work that is being celebrated by the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Awards in the School of International Futures. And we're using all of these critical looks and fresh voices to reframe our perceptions and to really see new paths to dance. And my question is, how do we think more about, no, I'm saying that wrong. How do we rebalance and reprivilege granular work, not just local work, individually local work in conversations about images of the future to help us really map the dance of anticipatory imagination? So what I'm going to do now is introduce someone to you. Her name is Maya, and we're going to try to sort of recreate the conversation we had, where we were wrestling with some big ideas, because we thought we disagreed with each other, and we kind of had to fight our way verbally to an understanding of what we were both saying. And I've just talked to you at very kind of high abstract conceptual levels. And so it's a nice balance. I would like Maya to share now an actual conversational practice that is at the granular individual level that really she has been engaged in since we first met, when I heard her work and went, that is fantastic. Also, she had these great postcards that people had drawn that I really, really loved, the visuals. But come up here and let's have a chat. And thank you for this. Thank you for your patience listening to that. And we can actually turn this off now. I don't know if I can do that with my magic. And seriously, it's the end of the day. And one of the things that we want to do is really rebalance out the levels of privilege here. So I was trying to say that I think, we need to get away from process. And Maya said, no, I have a process. I take people through a process. Tell me about your process.
So in the case of the conversational practice that I have been practicing since 2000, so a bit before we met, because that's the postcards were for an exhibition we made that reported on my very first field trip in that, with that purpose. So I use a semi-structured interview schedule, and I've actually interviewed experts and non-experts and people with and without diplomas and in 5 continents. I've done about 1,000, a bit more than 1,000 interviews now. And in these conversations start with my prompting for what they think my question means. Because my first question is, I tell them, like, listen, I'm somebody who is running a project, or he works around how people imagine the future everywhere on Earth. And is that actually a topic you think about? They don't even realize the interview has already started at that point. I just go...
They're still thinking, you go around the world and do what?
And then they go, the future. And they say yes or no. If they say no and they are a certain age, I will ask them, you don't have kids? If they say yes, I ask them, do you? And then sometimes they will add something about what they're actually thinking about when they think they're thinking about the future. Or I will ask them in what context, or even at what time of day. When does that happen to you? When do you think about the future? And from there, the schedule goes from personal futures to local futures to global futures, and then in the final stage, there are questions for the imagination. By the time we get there, they're sometimes ready for those questions. And in each layer, so both in the personal and the local and the global, we ask people about what they would prefer to see, what they fear they might see, and what they actually expect to see, or to live. Because we are like observers. We look, it's our job to learn to recognize things in the world, and so we come from an academic background, a lot of us, and we think that it's all about seeing, but a lot of people actually talk about living, and so that's a big difference to begin with. Now, what we were talking about with process was also that I'm not taking them into a process to find a particular set of images of the future that have to serve a particular purpose that has been predefined by the project. I'm just curious. I just want to hear them talk about the future. And they can feel that. There's a lot of the listening that you talk about as well in there, because you need to make people understand that they're also being heard. And in a lot of cases, because I said I was in 5 continents, you can imagine that language aspect that you were talking about is also really important. And it's really difficult to talk with people through an interpreter as well. So when I brought in a Belgian friend of mine to be my interpreter in Latin America, instead she became my Spanish teacher. And obviously I can't do that with languages for every country that we actually interviewed in. This started as my first independent postdoctoral research project. I'm a media studies person originally, what the future looks like on television, what representations exist of the future on television, and I combined that with a production study to find out where these images actually come from. What determines what we see on TV about the future? What kinds of choices are being made by makers and commissioners and the people who put the content on our small screen? And today it's an even smaller screen in many cases. And so from there I wanted to find out what's actually in people's hearts and minds. And the only way that you can find out is to talk about it, even if, I don't always understand what they might be on about. And so that's what I started this long monologue, apologies, with, is that to begin with, what do they think I mean? When I say I'm trying to talk with people all around the world about the future, what do they think I'm talking about? What do they think these people talk about? And what is it that they what is it that they think of when I say future? And the open pre-interview question that actually sounds to them like an invitation to participate is actually basically the most important question in the whole interview. So after going through the 3 stages, personal, local, and global, and we move into questions for the imagination, we ask people, I say we because I work at this with my partner who's a visual artist and who tries to render what these people tell us into actual pictures, which is an entirely different challenge, and we could be talking about that forever as well. yeah, then there are the questions for the imagination. I tell them, you figured it out. We are looking for the future. We are trying to find the future. And we've been here and there and everywhere. And where do you recommend we go to find the future? And that's a really wonderful question to be asking people, because they will not situate the future in the places that we do when we have our workshops on the future of education and use the 4 archetypes for that. They actually send us to the local chip shop, because you know, people have been eating chips forever, and they will do so, and I'm sure that it's still going to be packed with all kinds of people in the next 100 years, or they will send us to an amazing piece of architecture that is only newly arisen in their area, or they will send us to a particular event, or actually people send us to all kinds of places where they feel we might find the future. And the other question for the imagination is the one that abuses the long term. So during the conversation, we often set a time horizon. We ask people how old they are, and then when they're very young, we say, okay, double that. So that would be the fate of my students. When they're a bit older, we say, okay, add the time it takes for a newborn baby to grow into an adult. You know, the beginning of a lifetime.
Which in itself is different in different cultures.
Yes. There are different, also different stages, you know. But usually, in that case, you don't always, just like with the here question, the local question, where are we? Can somebody tell me where we are? Just shout something. Where are we? Berlin. Berlin. Somebody shout something different. Oh. Are you with your head in Singapore? Well, you might have said Germany, or you might have said the Humboldt Carré, or you might have said Europe, or you might have said Singapore, apparently. and a lot of the time, and because I ask people not what's the future, what do you imagine for the future of Berlin? Because I don't want to lead. As you know, my idea is to not prompt as much as I can afford to and still get responses. And so I will say, so let's talk about the future here. And then everything depends, and this is something to be really conscious about, because it happens to you in other settings as well. Everything depends on who they think I am. So when I was in Senegal, well, they thought I was a European, and so I must have been asking about Africa. So they would answer for the whole of the continent here. Or when I would be in Berlin, they would think like, oh, you're a Belgian, aren't you? So they'll talk about Berlin or Germany, because that's the thing that I would inquire about and that I don't know about, but they do. And so all these, the whole idea is, if we think about the future here, about which here are we thinking, and not just about which future, because which here we're thinking about determines what we're thinking about that future. And what is complicated is that I'm not just collecting something that's already in their head. By having the conversation, I'm also making them aware of the fact that they do have things in their head. And it's not the same as revealing the implicit assumptions like we do in the first stage of futures literacy exercises. It's actually that realization of, ah, yeah, I do think about it. When do I think about it? You should see, we have we present this in art exhibitions, and we have this selection of people going, when I ask them a question, we call it imagínate. people are sort of searching for where the future is in their own heads, and we help them with that. And that's a function that futurists take on, but we've become so good at it, you know, making it doable, simplifying all the things you've been explaining, that it made me think just now that maybe it's a bit of a reductionist stance that we've been beginning to take. And I don't know how useful that really is in the real world at the moment. Next.
Well, okay, so this was the conversation we were having. It was kind of, there was a more fun little sidebar when I was thinking, wow, there's so much yet to do, and maybe I should retire. And she said, oh no, you're like a Vogon, which is what I heard. And I thought, a Vogon? You mean one of those people in Hitchhiker's Guide that put in the like intergalactic? And she went, no, not Vogon, Dogon. And I went, oh, what do you mean?
What's a Dogon?
Which opened this other interesting concept. So I went to tell that story because I want to then hook it back to the archetypes and oversimplification. So what did you mean when you said I was kind of like a Dogon?
Okay, so we traveled in Mali, and we met local millet, a grain, and cattle farmers, whole villages of them, in a very dry and harsh environment. And so we make a point of interviewing people from all generations, and we would not focus on just the young or just the experts, or we want a varied sample. And so many of the elderly Dogon, these farmers in Mali that we interviewed, would tell me that for their personal future, the thing that they were hoping for was to die working on the field. What? I know it's hot here. It's really hot there. And they say, yeah, that's the best way to go. Working. That's how I want to go. Okay. And trying to figure it out, and then it comes a second time, and you're beginning to think, you're beginning to try and make connections between the first time it was mentioned. And then in a specific family, I also interviewed the grandchild of this elderly person. And I asked them about it, because they have an easier time, making the bridge, the intercultural bridge, the cross-cultural conversation. And so I asked them, your granddad wants to die on the field, what's that about? And he said, that's the greatest honor he could possibly have. It's so honorable to be, providing for your people. And if you can do that till your last moment, that's the honor, that's the most honorable death that exists. And the grandchild was convinced of it as well.
So here is exactly the illustration of my point. If you had gone in to that village and you had run, even in the best possible way, the most creative way, the most cross-culturally sensitive way, a classic futures workshop where you were using the 4 futures or some other variant of archetypes, would you ever have heard that? Would you ever have found that out? That is potentially, at a lovely, granular, textured, culturally and locally contextual level, an archetype that we should not be missing. And yes, we could shoehorn it maybe into the Protestant work ethic, which I guess is continued growth, but wow, we would strip away so much nuance, so much depth by doing that. And so, am I saying we should throw out all the archetypes tools and all our processes? Of course I'm not. I mean, they're useful in a lot of ways. But more and more, I've discovered that when I am doing workshops and I say to people, so what's your own personal aspiration for the future? I especially apologies to everyone here who is in government or was once in government, especially if it's policy people, what I'll get back is like high-level policy speak. And I'll say, no, you personally, what do you personally want for the future? And it's like they can't gear shift down into local, granular, personal, individual, because we're not having those conversations with them. We're not having these conversations with people. We're not, and I'm sure often the Futures Literacy workshops help open up some of those spaces, but the fact that essentially you've had 1,000 conversations where you've helped people open doors and windows and closets and maybe sub-basements and attics in their own minds, and discovered that there were really interesting thoughts about the future there that they hadn't reflected on. And there's a great quote that I sadly don't have immediately to hand. I should probably put it at the end of every single slide deck I have, from Ursula Le Guin, who is both a child of anthropologists and in many ways an anthropologist herself and a science fiction writer, where she was asked about writing science fiction and how could such a great writer as herself waste her life writing escapist trash, essentially. And she kind of said, well, science fiction is, we live in a house. There's the house of our minds, our cultures, and imagination, and we live in this house. And it's a pretty great house, and we tend to only use about 3 rooms in it. And science fiction, read future studies, and science fiction helps people walk through the house of their imagination, the house of their culture, and throw open the windows and throw open the doors and run and play games from the attic all the way down to the basement and really understand where they live. And it seems to me that that's a lot of what you have been doing and what this work of having conversations at a much more granular level does. And I think at this point, we would really kind of like to pass the talking stick around. I kind of wish that somehow we could spend just 30 seconds looking at those seats behind me and imagining the Dogon farmer, and imagining some of the kids that I talk to in the Marshall Islands about the future of their country and sea level rise, imagining all of the people who aren't here and who we don't have these extended conversations with and that we need to bring into the room. And that's kind of where we were. So the talking sticks are now yours to request.
So we're asking you, who would you like to sit on those chairs, right? Whose voices are we not hearing at the moment, and whose voices are actually relevant?
I think there's, even looking around in Berlin, I just go down the street and there's this guy on the street sleeping in a sleeping bag, and what kind of future does he feel or she feels will have? And yeah, I think that's one person. I'm sure there's others.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for the question, and also for the question you gave us. What do you personally want for the future? Because and one person I would like to see there was, and there's a little story behind it. Last weekend I was in the swamp in the wetlands in the northern part of Germany, in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and wetlands are very important for fighting climate change, because we need to make them wet again so they take the CO2 level. And we were talking about the future of the wetlands. What was interesting at the end of this workshop was that all the people we were talking with were coming from academia. None of them actually owned the wetlands. And we were wondering, how can we bring the farmers to the table? Because the farmers have totally different issues with that. They need to make money out of the lands, and if the land is wet, they cannot survive, they cannot support their families. And this morning I came to the conference going to the participatory futures session, going to other sessions, and wondering, okay, what can I do to reach out to the farmers? Because the farmers, they don't understand things like storytelling. They don't understand posters on the wall. They need other questions to talk with. They need another way of talking with them. And I think this question that you gave me, what do you personally want for the future? That's the question I can reach out to them. That's the question I can discuss with them to create like a common basis. So thank you.
I'll come to you. Sorry.
Okay.
Just,
Should,
oh, sorry.
no, I had another idea, actually. Why not ask the wetlands themselves?
Okay, then I'll spare that might spare in my response.
I would love to hear it.
It will come. Javier, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm working with agriculture, with farmers in France as well, and in Africa. And I can tell you that they can absolutely understand storytelling. But this is the kind of storytelling you tell. Of course, if you are going, well, I'm working in Cameroon and Congo, and if you are going to them talking about European agriculture with tractor and all this kind of engineering things, and of course they cannot just absorb the story because the story is too far from their reality. But if you are talking their language, you know, maybe the most significant thing I can tell about this is I was in charge to build a road in Cameroon. And we made a foresight exercise to try to understand what would be the best, the place where the road should be constructed, should be built. And after the end of this foresight exercise, one of the person in charge said, okay, now we stop it, you can go make some tourism, and we will talk again in 2 days. I said, why? I'm supposed to be here and to do my job. I say, no, first we have to ask to the people of the water. Oh, I said, okay, people of the water, I don't have this in my file, so okay. I felt a little bit stupid because I didn't know what was this, so I think it's a local institution, something like that, and so I waited. But 2 days after, I said, okay, maybe now I should ask about this people of the water because I felt really uncomfortable not knowing about this. And then they explained very quietly and kind of rationally to me that on the land where the new road should go, there was a river. And the road should go over a bridge, over the river. And in the river, inside the river, was living a people of water, having their children and parents and everything, and living there with their own farmers, and the road would go over those farms. And so they had to talk with them in order to decide where the road should be. I say, okay, maybe I can talk with them. I say, no, you cannot because you are European. If you would be a Cameroonese, you could talk with them, but you couldn't. You see, I mean, we have to as Europeans, we have to stretch our mind so far to be able to find the meaningful stories that can speak to them. But we can find them, believe me.
Thank you.
Okay. I have some thoughts, and I think what she said kind of resonated. I was thinking of the fable of the troll under the bridge. So you're looking at the local inhabitants in the river. So I think the implication is we are trying to hear the voices of the marginalized, right? But some other types of folks also are relevant. So who's the most repugnant type of person, but who's relevant to that universe, be it an extremist, someone everyone hates, so I think that type of person, how do you deal with him? But you probably have to, right? Especially if they have power to block the preferred future, you know, or you might have an epiphany talking to them. That's one type. Another type would be, I think, people who really are in the elites who don't typically talk to consultants or regular people. You know, like if talk to someone like Elon Musk, for example, you know, who has the power to enact some futures and has a view of the preferred futures that he may be more candid on in a one-on-one than if he's talking on, like, you know, CNBC. Yep.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can connect with that because I would like to invite the traumatized parts in people, like something we, I think, systemically not invite to the conversations, which is some subconscious, of course, but I think it's driving a lot of what we do in the world. So I know it's a bit also more abstractive, like maybe a reversal life, but what we know from psychology is that the traumatized part we are not aware is part of us is also very alive. So I would like to invite these parts because they are really driving a lot of decisions we make. Thank you.
You can already give the mic to Hank. I wanted to respond to two of the things I heard here. One is your question was, sorry, I'm losing my focus at the end of the night. The farmers, yes. So one thing is that you do use intermediaries a lot of the time. Actually, in India, I was told that I wouldn't be able to speak to women in a certain village. And not because I was a European, but because they don't know anything, I was told. Really, you can go to the village, but they don't know anything. They're not going to be able to give you any answers. Now, you have to remember that you're not looking for information that they hold. You are looking for perspectives. And that means that you are able to even compare with your own perspective when you are talking to, you can tell farmers, you know, I know nothing. This is what I understand. Now, please explain to me what I should understand to get an inkling of your perspective. The other thing is, we've been talking about individual conversations, and I think that Elon Musk probably has practiced so much that he'll only give his standard story anyway. But it's also the point, and that's why I think your remark was really important, that these individual conversations should also be brought together in a way, because it's not going to change the continued growth archetype used by the majority of people even in this space. Well, not literally this one, but the whole of the Humboldt-Corée and the people, you know, that finance all our work. And this if we want the perspectives of these people that I spoke with to be included in the decisions that they take, they actually also need to talk with each other. So there is the individual, but there is also the collective, and that's the next challenge, how to bring those together. But Hank, please make another suggestion for people to include.
I have a suggestion of a difficult group and less difficult group. So the difficult group are the next generation, the children not yet born, who is speaking for them. And at the same time, you have the generations that have passed away. And I'd love to get the perspective of what they would have done differently, or what they half did, but afterwards think they should have done. That's a difficult one, but I think still it's possible to get people who can speak for them. The less difficult one is a very practical one, because in my work I know that 1/3 of the people of Europe never get listened to. and they are children up until they get to vote, because who cares about what they really think, and elder people one day after they go on retirement, because they have nothing to say anymore. And to get them in the chairs might be possible, but to get people to listen to them, that's the trick.
So, thank you. I've actually done a project in which I mirrored people who had been around in 1958. So this is a project I ran in 2008, and who were around in 1958 to visit the World Expo in Brussels. And so the World Fair exhibition. And I asked them about their images of the future then and how they saw this event. And then I asked them about their images of the future at that moment and projecting to 2058. And then I interviewed people that fitted the same demographic description as they did in 1958. So a man who was 16 worked at the expo as a butcher, literally. And so I went to interview a young man studying to be a butcher and was 16 years old in 2008 as well, and asked him the same questions. I think, so I'm leaving the kids up to others. I find that really exceedingly difficult, but I don't know.
Especially the unborn. There is, interestingly, an exercise, and again, so part of the reason, how can I put this? In essence, that was me critiquing myself, because my primary activity in Futures for 40 years has been collecting tools and methods and approaches that people can use to come together in groups and have these conversations. And yet I have, all along been looking for some good way to have those conversations, or these days, is there a way that we can make some of our digital environment an open space in which people can share their ideas about the future? It's a little trickier because you don't have the help in opening all the doors and windows in your mind, but that's part of what the Our Futures project is meant to do. And in fact, there is a focus on, as I said, involving students and schools in particular to do that. So to some extent, I sort of I always would want to know and figure out ways to have the kind of conversations that Maya has been pursuing her whole career in Futures. But there is a part of me that still likes shiny, glittery, lovely, fun process toys. There is one that speaks directly to this idea of multiple generations, and it sort of builds off of a scholar that we both greatly appreciate, Robert Textor, who is an anthropologist and did a lot of work having those kinds of conversations in really remote rural villages in Thailand. He was fluent in Thai, so he could do that. And one of the things that he immediately realized was that he had to remind people of the change that they'd lived through. So one of the classic structures he built into his conversations, which I now regularly build into workshops, is pull people at least twice as far back into the past as you want them to think forward into the future. So if he wanted them to have a conversation with him about what futures might be like for their children, he would ask them about what conditions were like daily life for their grandparents, and how that was different than for their parents, and how their parents' lives were different from their own, and then would say, what do you expect the future, your children's lives might be like in the future? And Richard Slaughter took that and turned it into a lovely exercise called the generations chain. And you can think of it as 4 columns of grandparents, your parents, you, and your children. And under each column, what were the major events that group experienced? What were their deepest fears? And what were their aspirations, And when I think about that for my parents and grandparents, well, my grandparents were actually draft dodgers from Germany who moved to the US. But or conscientious objectors, I guess I should say. But my parents, it was very much, wow, a major event in their young lives was the Depression. They came out of that with the sort of classic Depression area, save all your money, don't throw things away, get things as cheaply as possible, be very parsimonious with your resources, and wow, the house in suburbia with the white picket fence was kind of their vision of an aspirational future, right? Very different to what I feel, very different if I'd had children. And if I think about my niece and nephew, there are some distinct differences to what they want. So it works through that, and it at least asks that question of people in their imagination, without actually trying to figure out the metaphysics of going forward in time to interview the unborn, which sounds scary.
It does. Also, I think that part of why we were reacting to the unborn is also because part of the point that at least I'm trying to make is that we are not talking for others. And we actually often do develop images of the future, scenarios that we then drop on a desk to be used as intended by the person who commissioned them or the group that commissioned them. So this is very different. This is about finding what exists around us that are these images of the future. We always say that we're interested in images of the future because we can't go to the future and make empirical observations there. So the only thing we can talk about is what's in our hearts and minds and how we imagine the future. And that brings with it that, we're necessarily based in the present. But you are right, of course, that the young and the old are among the marginalized in our Western societies, not in all societies. That is the case. Elders are very much respected in some other cultures, of course, and would always first get the word and actually complicate speaking with younger people, because if they hear what their elders responded, they will not respond in any other way. So there is a lot of it's not an easy task to try and do this intercultural work, but I think that by saying that we can't necessarily do it well, and it's a difficult thing to do, that doesn't mean that we should just stay in our own vestiges, and also that we shouldn't be trying to at least find inspiration for other ways of looking at the future than the ways that we have been practicing so much in our own field already. I do at some point also want to return to this workshopping question, because that's a strange one to want to return to, I understand, because I think that having these individual conversations only makes sense if it becomes something collective.
A group
yes.
conversation.
I just have one question, because you said language is a real problem. Have you ever tried other tools in the sense of drawing, letting people be more imaginative, and music, I think, is a really common one?
We didn't drop a mole in the group now. No. You want to talk about that, Wendy? Or
Yes, although, well, I mean, there is the whole vast now emerging area of design futures and everything else. But I think in a lot of workshops that I've been involved in, one of the first things that we do is hand people pieces of paper. And I was lucky enough to learn how to do visioning workshops from wow, I just, Elise Boulding. I love getting old. Your brain kind of crops out at you in unfortunate moments. Elise Boulding, who spent a lot of time organizing what she called the Imaging the Future as a World Without Weapons workshops. What was always interesting to me about that, again, was the first phase of that visioning workshop was this work. It was the work of opening up the doors and windows and cubby holes of your brain and thinking, what is it that I want? How do I clarify my own values and articulate, based on them, a very specific idea with details of what future I want? And it started off with a sort of meditative visualization session, and then she'd send everyone away and literally say, sit for 2 hours. Have you ever sat for 2 hours and tried to think about one thing? She was tough. She was a tough disciplinarian. So think about that and then draw it. And so the point at which we were starting to collaborate, it wasn't me walking up and saying, oh, well, I envision this future where, you know, there were no cars and we were all nice to each other and whatever. No, it was draw it. Even if you have to use stick figures and, you know, big circles and blocks and whatever, draw it. And we would spread all the drawings out on the floor and walk around. It was like a gallery. And the point at that point was, she'd say, look around at everything everyone has drawn and find 2 or 3 that resonate with you the most, visually, before we even get to words. You will be a working group. And then start sharing the textures and details and senses. And the warm-up for that was incredibly, actually, sensual. She would say, so the first thing I want you to share with each other is, as an active listening exercise, is one of the happiest moments of your life that you can talk about publicly, kind of was the underlying thing there. So, and one person listens and prompts for, what did it sound like, what did it smell like, what were the colors, what were you seeing, what were you hearing. Get it down in detail as rich as possible, and be prepared to tell your partner's story in as great detail. And they should be listening to yours and telling your story about this happiest moment. So, boy, if you ever want to warm up, do that. People share happy stories and the whole room is filled with joy. It is amazing. And you hear stunning stories about, you know, and there I was at the birth of my son, or just amazing. It's an amazing process. But that tunes your imagination into thinking, yes, the future I inhabit will be a future that I will sense fully. What will that be like? So it's not just visualizing, it's trying to fully imagine. And of course, a lot of the design work and experiential futures work has really been built, you know, is built to really reinforce and amplify that aspect, I think, of futures thinking. Wow, I don't remember the question anymore. Over to you.
It was about using visual or other forms than language-based forms to talk with these people that aren't here. Now, so I work a lot with my partner, who's a photographer and a cameraman, and I've mentioned it before. And at a certain point, I wanted to argue, you know, for these visuals, and I began to feel, as I was writing my paper, that I'm overstating the case here. There's something wrong. What's going wrong? And the thing that was wrong was that I was writing 5,000 words, and despite the fact that a picture is worth 1,000 words, I would never have been able to write that essay as 5 pictures. There is a difference. You do not communicate the same things. When Wendy started to give her example, she was talking about the feelings and the way that people were and the senses, and it's a different thing, and you need to cover all the bases, I think. So I'm not inclined to want to move away too far from also using language, but as you know, I'm very much also engaged in putting pictures into the future.
And sounds and sense and
yes.
stuff. I mean, really interesting work has been done with actually what triggers memory the most. And we use the part of our brain that we use for visualizing memories. We use that mechanism, those neurons, to actually visualize futures, which is problematic in some senses, because potentially there's a constraint there of getting on sort of reinscribing a history forward into the future. But the one thing that's interesting about that to me is that one of the strongest triggers of memories that you don't even remember you have is scent. And much has been written about that. But, and so to me, there's this whole untapped area of literally what does the future smell like? So, sorry, there was another question.
Yeah, just a mere remark. Following the previous stream, what you mentioned concerning the images or meditation or things like that, because the one who I would invite would be, what I wanted to mention, is ourselves behind the ego. And this is what you were talking about, so this is why just a note here. Yesterday I was talking about an experiment which was participative action research I did with the children in a school in terms of the futures of work. And of course, as you cannot make a survey, you know, with small children. They can't even write. But the point was creating images. And the whole process, the most important part of the process was this kind of preliminary exercises to get to that future in order to create those images, which was a kind of meditative games and things like that. Now, what I wanted to say that I repeated it with the same children 4 years later, which was this June. Now they are 13, 14, and they wrote an essay on their future profession. However, the preliminary part, this kind of meditative games, were the same. And what was really interesting that, well, after this game, okay, we travel to the future, imagine all the details, the circumstances, how old you are, what kind of consumes you have, and so on and so forth. Okay, now write your essay. And some of the students were very much embarrassed. And I asked, okay, what's the problem? And she mentioned, a girl, that the problem is that the image I saw was completely different what I think of myself to have a profession in the future. So I've never thought of that kind of image before. So it was somewhere in her unconscious, which was completely contradictory to her image in her conscious that, okay, what kind of future I can imagine. Yeah.
Very much so, because we do say that we reveal, you know, implicit assumptions, but this was actually even, you know, a step further.
We, by the way, are 8 minutes over time.
Already?
And I'm happy to sit here and talk more, but I did want to remind you in case any of you were kind of...
Thank you for the role switch there, Wendy. That should have been me. I'm sorry.
No, that's... anyway. Any other questions, comments?
So we have a homeless person from Berlin. We have a farmer from... Which area was it? Mecklenburg?
Mecklenburg.
And we
sitting next to the farmer from Dogon, the Dogon farmer.
Sitting next to the Dogon farmer. And we have, well, I'm not going to put the features there, I'm sorry, I'll put a very old person there. And we have yourself, the hidden selves, which are even, I think, more complicated than intercultural and cross-cultural communication, I have to admit. And that's our traumatized parts, right? Okay, so that's already a summary.
That's a good summary. And I'd also like to say again that this was very much about rocking back and forth between what we do to fabricate futures. That's how I usually talk about it to my grad students, fabricating futures. And it's useful to have a good set of tools for that, and a varied set of tools for that you can use for different issues, different contexts, different groups of people with different needs and different kind of cultures, and found futures, and helping people find their futures. And I think that's something that I'd like to do more of. You're my role model. I'm so happy. Anyway. And I found my Ursula... yes. Symbiotic. And I found, obviously, my Ursula Le Guin quote. So are there other comments? Okay.
Yeah, I'm maybe one more comment, because I think it fits very well into the discussion we have currently. One problem that I often come across when I try to take the images of the future that people have, or like take them out of them and to bring them out, let's put it this way, is that they're often very abstract. And so then when I ask them, how do you imagine the future, or what do you wish to be in the future, how do you imagine it? And then they say like, well, I wish the future will be better. I wish the future will be more sustainable or more diverse. So they come with those container words, and you can't really see that. What do you mean by that? So I'm looking for ways to make them, to get them more concrete, or to say that, in other words, to make the implicit vision they have more explicit. Yeah, I think one way would probably be that, and I came, as you said, that your husband or your partner is a photographer. It reminded me on a course I once did with students where we did films, because with filming you have the problem that you cannot hide yourself behind those container words. You have to picture it. You have to find something where you can put the lens on and say, okay, here it is, how I imagine, and you have to show it. Yeah.
The two words that I use constantly in facilitating futures workshops are be specific. And every time I do that, I think back to my 8th grade writing instructor who had literally be specific and specificity wallpapering the walls of her classroom because it was a key to good writing as far as she was concerned. But between saying be specific and saying, all right, what I want you to do, you want the future to be better. You wake up in the morning, how is it better? How is waking up better? Is brushing your teeth better? Is your breakfast better? Is work better? Are you commuting to work? Are you working at all? Is that what's better, that you're not working? Unlike the Dogon farmer. You know, that the greatest honor is self-reflection, you know, you are in a Buddhist retreat, whatever it is. Tell me how your day is different. And you have to get down to, again, it's about granularity, because probably everybody on the planet would say, yes, we want peace.
On Earth.
The question, peace on Earth. The question is,
especially at Christmas.
And how do we get there? And that was one of the interesting things that would come up in the World Without Weapons workshops. Would be, of course we all want peace, and she'd say yes. So we're going to be specific about this. You can paint a picture, Elise Boulding would say, of any preferred future. Your preferred future can have any attributes you want, anything that would express your values. Anything. It's your future to desire, with one rule: it has to be a world without weapons. And we'd all think, oh, that's easy. And then she said, yeah, define weapon. And then all of a sudden you'd be going, I don't know, so no steak knives? What? So, no nail clippers? I mean, think about all the things post 9/11 that they were searching for, right? So what is a weapon? So be specific, and it's difficult because it's not something we're asked to do. And quite frankly, and this is again my problem with policymakers and decision makers, if you're at a certain level of professionalism, you are penalized for being specific, and the more you keep things abstract and and in passive voice, the bane of good writing, the more you put things in passive voice, so we don't know who's doing it, it was done by someone, the future was improved by not us, someone else, it's mushy thinking, and it gets in the way of being creative and inspirational. So we have to get better at fabricating. We have to get better at really searching out and finding. Any other?
I actually have a one from my own thinking now that just came up because of what we were doing, is that, when we talk about speaking about conversations with individuals and we land in personal futures, all the examples we've given is about people's own lives. While actually, the questions I ask are also about local futures, and they go beyond our lives, and about global futures, and they go beyond our lives, and even beyond the lives of our grandchildren, because like we have living history, we have living futures. And I think that that's actually something to really reflect upon. And then there is the fact that I actually run a workshop called the Toynbee Convector, where people are asked to describe the picture that my husband has to go and take to depict their peace on earth or their better future. You wanted to say something still? You looked like you did. Okay.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you very much.
So also thank you to the people who are not here, but especially to you guys who are here, and to you,
And to
Wendy.
you. We hoped, based on our conversation, we knew we were going to have fun. We hoped you would have fun. And just to send us out, I'll read, and actually this is always hard because it brings tears to my eyes every time. I'll read the Le Guin quote. And again, remember, this is a woman who all her life was sort of told, A, you're a woman writing science fiction. I thought only guys did that. And also, why are you wasting your talents? That gets me. Okay, if science fiction has a major gift to offer literature, I think it is just this: the capacity to face an open universe, physically open, psychically open, no doors shut. And that really speaks to futures. What science, from physics and astronomy to history and psychology, has given us is the open universe. A cosmos that is not a simple fixed hierarchy, but an immensely complex process in time. All the doors stand open, from the pre-human past through the incredible present to the terrible and hopeful future. All connections are possible. All alternatives are thinkable. It's not a comfortable, reassuring place. It's a very large house, a very drafty house, but it's the house we live in. And science fiction, future studies, seems to be the modern literary art which is capable of living in that huge and drafty house and feeling at home there and playing games up and down the stairs from basement to attic. May you inhabit your house.
I wish there was no physical distancing now.